had been falling on Halifax for 3 days straight when Marcus Hale noticed the wheelchair. Not the woman in it, the chair itself. He had been mopping the east corridor of the Aldercroft building for 11 months, long enough to know which tiles held water at the seams and which overhead lights flickered before they gave out entirely. Long enough to know that the woman on the 14th floor arrived at 7:40 each morning in a black SUV and left, if she left at all, sometime after 9 at night. He had seen her through glass, through half-open doors, through the narrow gap between a rolling cart and a marble wall. He had never looked directly at her the way you don't look directly at someone who has learned to treat being looked at as a form of aggression. But tonight the corridor was empty and the wheelchair was parked outside her office door at an angle that gave him a clean line of sight to the rear axle assembly. And Marcus Hale had spent 8 years building adaptive equipment for logging operations up and down the eastern shore before the accident that took 2 fingers off his right hand and his contract with it. A man who has spent 8 years calculating load-bearing tolerances on equipment that keeps other men alive cannot unsee a lateral brace rod that is seated 3 centimeters too far inboard on a chair that someone is depending on to hold. He stopped pushing the mop. The chair's right lateral brace was wrong. Not wrong the way a thing wears out from use. Wrong the way a thing is built wrong on purpose. A load distribution that would push the right hip progressively inward with every hour of sitting, would torque the sacral joint in a direction it was never meant to move, would make it look, over time, like the body inside the chair was simply continuing to deteriorate. He was still looking at it when the office door opened. Her name was Diane Ashworth. He knew that from the building directory, from the brass plate on the door, from 11 months of emptying her bin and wiping her glass table and never once being spoken to directly. She was 47. She had run Aldercroft Capital for 12 years, first under her father's name, then under her own. 4 years ago, her car had been struck by a truck that ran a red light on Roby Street in the middle of a February ice storm, and she had not walked since. That was the version of the story the building knew. She looked at him the way she looked at everything that appeared in her peripheral vision without announcement. Precise, brief, already moving past it. He cleared his throat. Miss Ashworth, the lateral brace on your chair, the right one, it's misaligned. She stopped. Not with surprise. With the particular stillness of a woman who has learned to take the measure of a situation before she moves inside it. Excuse me. The inboard seat of the brace rod. He kept his voice level. It should be flush with the frame rail. Yours is set 3 centimeters shy. Every hour you sit in that chair, it's pushing your right hip. And your credentials are. I built adaptive equipment for logging rigs for 8 years. Load distribution, weight transfer. It's the same mechanics. She looked at him for a long moment. He was aware of exactly what she was seeing. The gray uniform, the mop handle, the 2 fingers missing from his right hand. Mr. Hale. Mr. Hale. Her voice carried the tone of someone closing a file. My chair was custom fabricated by specialists. It's been assessed by 3 separate physiotherapists in the last year alone. I know what I'm looking at. I'm sure you believe that. She turned back to the door. Good night. He picked up the mop. He pushed it down the corridor toward the service elevator. He could feel her not watching him, which was its own kind of watching. 14 floors below, in the corner office that faced the harbor, a man named Peter Voss sat with his jacket folded over the back of his chair and a glass of water he hadn't touched in an hour. The desk between him and the window held 2 things. He returned to every evening before he locked up. A framed photograph of himself and Gerald Ashworth at a fishing camp in Guysborough, taken the summer before Gerald died, and a corporate restructuring document that he had been slowly, patiently, methodically moving toward completion for the better part of 3 years. Gerald Ashworth had built Aldercroft Capital out of a single brokerage office on Barrington Street. He had built it into the largest private investment firm east of Montreal. He had been brilliant, loyal, and deeply, catastrophically trusting of the man he had brought in from Toronto at 32 to run his operations division, and whom he had, in the last months before his heart gave out, asked to look after his daughter. Peter will take care of you, Gerald had said. He had taken Diane's hand and pressed it between both of his. Peter has never once put himself ahead of this firm. Diane had been 43. She had just come out of 8 months of rehabilitation following the accident. She had believed her father in the way children believe, the last serious thing a dying parent says to them, which is to say, completely and without reservation and with no remaining capacity to question it. Voss had managed her affairs with the patience of a man tending something that would eventually be worth managing. He reviewed every medical consultation she pursued, sat in on every meeting where her capacity to lead was discussed, appeared in her office doorway with the same measured expression each time a new specialist surfaced a possibility she had not considered. "Diane," he would say, sitting down without being invited, setting his hands flat on the desk the way a reasonable man sets his hands on a table. "You know I want this for you more than anything. But I've seen what these clinics do to people in your position. They see the name, they see the portfolio. They sell hope like a product, and when it doesn't work, you're the one who carries it." She had heard it enough times that she had stopped scheduling second opinions, had stopped reading the papers her physiotherapist flagged, had stopped, somewhere in the second year, believing that anyone in her medical orbit was saying something that hadn't already passed through Peter Voss's hands. Marcus Hale came back the following week. He came back the week after that. He was good at his work and quiet about it, and he did not raise the subject of the chair again. He cleaned around her when she was in. He did not intrude. On the third week, at 11:45 on a Wednesday, she looked up from her screen and said, without preamble, "You said 3 centimeters." He looked up from the window he was wiping. "I did." Measured from where? The outer frame rail to the brace foot. It should be flush. The gap means the brace is deflecting load inward instead of distributing it down. She was quiet for a moment. "My right hip has been worse this year." He said nothing. He did not need to. "I haven't told anyone that," she said. "More to the window than to him." He went back to the glass. "You don't have to tell me either." But she did, eventually. Not all at once, not directly, but in the way a person releases pressure from a sealed system, a degree at a time over weeks, until one night she told him about the accident and about her father and about the specialist in Montreal who had sent a report in the spring of the year after the accident that Voss had summarized for her in 2 sentences and which she had never actually read herself. And Marcus told her in the same fragmentary way about the logging camps and the 8 years of equipment work and the accident that had taken his fingers and his contract, and about his daughter Lily, 12 years old, who had spent most of the last 3 years in and out of the Children's Hospital on University Avenue with a degenerative joint condition that her rheumatologist had identified a treatment protocol for, and which their insurer, Meridian Health Alliance, had denied 4 times in 14 months. He did not know, because he had no reason to know, that Meridian Health Alliance carried 40% of its managed care contracts through a holding company called Aldercroft Capital Partners. He did not know that the actuarial model behind their denial algorithm had been presented to Aldercroft's board of directors as a revenue optimization instrument and approved in that room on the 14th floor, at that desk, under that name. He only knew that his daughter's file came back with the same word every time. Denied. And that each time it came back, she asked him from her hospital bed whether the medicine was coming, and he told her it was, and he drove home through Halifax streets he no longer saw and sat in the parking lot of their apartment building for long enough that the car grew cold around him. It was a Tuesday in November when he found the email. He was pulling the recycling bin from beneath the small table in the East Conference Room on the 12th floor, when a printed page slid out onto the floor from a folder someone had left open beside a cold coffee cup. He picked it up to put it back, and the letterhead stopped him. Voss Meridian Consulting, a name he had not seen before. The address was a numbered company registered in Fredericton. The page was a progress summary. It listed Diane Ashworth's medical file by case number. It listed her chair specifications under a maintenance heading, noting the brace adjustment completed in the 3rd quarter and the projected timeline for the next. It listed, in a column labeled Intervention Status, 3 physiotherapists by name, with the word Managed written next to each. And at the bottom, in a section labeled Asset Preservation Timeline, it noted the projected date for a competency review under the amended Aldercroft Partnership Agreement that would transfer operational control of the firm to its chief operating officer in the event of the controlling partner's certified incapacity to lead. He stood in the conference room for a long time. He thought about the chair. He thought about the way Voss had appeared in the corridor once, briefly, a month ago, and looked at him the way a man looks at something he is calculating the weight of. He thought about the Montreal specialist whose report had been summarized in 2 sentences. He thought about Lily's file coming back stamped. He thought about the column that said managed. He folded the page. He put it inside his jacket. He went back to his cart. She was working late on the 14th floor. She was always working late. He set down the bin. He did not pick up the mop. He took the page from his jacket and laid it on her desk without saying anything and stepped back. She read it without changing her face. Her face, he had learned, was something she had trained to hold very still. Her hand moved to the edge of the page. "Where did you find this?" 12th floor, conference room. Someone left the folder open. "When?" "Tonight." She looked up at him, and then she looked back at the page, and then she said, very quietly, "Mr. Hale, I need you to leave my office now." He left. He was in the lobby when the security desk called him over. The man behind the desk was apologetic in the practiced way of someone following instructions he finds distasteful. He asked Marcus for his keycard. He handed Marcus a small cardboard box containing his jacket, his spare boots, his thermos, and a drawing Lily had done in crayon that he had kept taped to the inside of his locker for 7 months. He walked Marcus to the front doors of the Aldercroft building and stood there while Marcus crossed the street into the November dark. Marcus stood on the sidewalk across from the building for a long time. The harbor wind came off the water and pushed through his jacket. Above him, the 14th floor burned. She did not sleep. She sat at her desk and looked at the page he had left, and she thought about Peter, and about the word managed, and about her father. She thought about the Montreal report she had never read. She thought about the chair, and the right hip that had been worsening since spring, and the 3rd quarter brace adjustment listed in the progress summary like a maintenance item on a vehicle. At 2 in the morning, she called her assistant, Eleanor, who had worked for her father before her, and who was the only person in the building whose loyalty she did not, at this moment, feel the need to re-examine. She told Eleanor what she needed. Eleanor did not ask questions. She had worked for Gerald Ashworth for 19 years, and she had learned early that the questions that matter answer themselves if you move fast enough. By 7 the next morning, Eleanor had the Montreal report in full. It was dated March of the year following the accident. The author was a spinal rehabilitation specialist named Dr. Helene Fournier. The report was 14 pages. Peter Voss's summary of it had been 2 sentences. Dr. Fournier's conclusion occupied a full paragraph on page 11. The injury sustained in February was consistent with an incomplete spinal lesion at the L3 level, with timely surgical decompression and aggressive physiotherapy initiated within a 24-month window. Full or near full motor recovery was a reasonable clinical expectation. No contraindications to intervention were identified. She had been 2 years out from that window when she read those words for the first time. She set the report down. She picked up the chair specification page Marcus had found. She read the line about the brace adjustment. She read it again. She pulled up the company registry for Voss Meridian Consulting on her laptop and found the incorporation date, 6 weeks after her father's funeral. She looked at her hands on the desk. They were the hands of a woman who had been running a firm for 12 years, who had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, who had approved in the 2nd year of her tenure at the recommendation of her chief operating officer a revenue optimization model for their managed care holdings that she had been told would improve margins across the portfolio. She had approved it in his room, at this desk. She pulled up the Meridian Health Alliance quarterly file. She pulled up the denial statistics for the previous 18 months. She found the line item for pediatric rheumatology claims. She found the denial rate, 81% on first submission. She sat with that number for a very long time. She had not thought of Marcus Hale's daughter before that moment. She thought of her now. Eleanor found her still at the desk at 8:30. Diane handed her a second list. Eleanor looked at it and then looked at her employer and then picked up her bag and left to get it done. It took 2 days to verify what she already knew. The chair specifications traced to a company called Maritime Adaptive Solutions, incorporated 4 years ago in a numbered holding registered to Peter Voss's brother-in-law in Dartmouth. The royalty structure on the chair contract paid $11,000 per year to the holding company, It was not the money that mattered. The money was not the point. The point was that the man who had told her no one could be trusted had been building a structure around her piece by piece for 4 years, and had used her name to approve the instrument that denied her building maintenance worker's daughter the medicine she needed to walk without pain. She did not confront Voss. Not yet. She was not ready for what happened after she confronted Voss. She needed to be standing when that happened. Not in the chair. Standing. She called the number Eleanor had found. A physiotherapist named Gwen Tran, who had been removed from the Aldercroft-approved provider list 2 years ago for what Voss had described as a conflict of professional interest. Gwen Tran answered on the second ring, listened without interruption, and said, "Tell me where you are. I'll come to you." Marcus was in the parking lot of his apartment building in Fairview when his phone rang. He did not recognize the number. He answered anyway because Lily's school sometimes called from numbers he didn't have saved, and he could not afford to miss a call about Lily. It was Eleanor. She told him his key card had been reactivated as of that morning. She told him his position was reinstated. She told him that Ms. Ashworth would like to speak with him at his earliest convenience, and that if he preferred not to return to the building, she understood, and Ms. Ashworth understood, and there would be no pressure of any kind. He sat in the parking lot for a moment. Lily was at school. The sky over Fairview was a flat November gray. "I'll come in," he said. She was not in the wheelchair when he arrived. She was in a rented physiotherapy room on the 3rd floor, standing between 2 parallel bars that Gwen had sourced from a clinic across town, her arms taking most of her weight, her face doing the thing it did where it held very still even when she was not calm at all. She had been at it for 3 days. She could hold her weight for about 40 seconds before her legs gave. Gwen marked it in a notebook each time. The numbers were going up. "Mr. Hale," Diane said. "Marcus," he said. She looked at him from between the bars. "I owe you an apology." "No. I had you removed from the building. You were protecting yourself. That's not the same as owing me an apology." She was quiet for a moment. "I found the Montreal report." He didn't say anything. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not to you. I mean, I am, but that's not the apology I mean." She let out a slow breath through her nose, the breath of someone managing something physical. "I signed the denial model. For Meridian. I signed it at Peter's recommendation, and I didn't read the underlying criteria because I trusted him, and I've been sitting with that." "You didn't know what it was." "I should have read it." Her hands tightened on the bar. "Your daughter's file. I want to fix it. I want to fix all of them, but I want to start with hers." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Lily asking him from the hospital bed whether the medicine was coming. He thought about the parking lot, the cold car, the harbor dark outside the window. "Okay," he said. "Okay?" "Yeah," he said. "Okay." The board of Aldercroft Capital met on a Thursday at 9 in the morning in the main conference room on the 14th floor. Voss arrived first, as he always did, with the competency review documentation in a black portfolio and the revised partnership agreement flagged at the signature lines, and a manner of comfortable certainty that comes from a man who has run every variable and found them all in order. The door at the far end of the room opened at 9:12. She came in on forearm crutches. 2 of them, lightweight aluminum, borrowed from Gwen's clinic. She moved slowly and without apology, the way a woman moves when she has decided that the pace of the room is going to adjust to her and not the other way around. The first step took time. The second was steadier. By the 4th step, the room had gone so quiet that the sound of her crutch tips on the hardwood was the only thing in it. She took the chair at the head of the table. Her father's chair, the one she had let Voss occupy for 3 years because it had seemed, at the time, like the practical thing to do. She sat down, and she looked at Peter Voss. His face was still. His face was always still. He was very good at still. Marcus came in behind her. He was wearing the jacket he kept for Lily's school concerts, navy, slightly too broad at the shoulder. He laid a folder in front of each board member without speaking. The folder contained the full Montreal report, the Voss Meridian Consulting registration documents, the Maritime Adaptive Solutions holding company structure, the chair specification page annotated by Gwen Tran with the brace misalignment marked in red. The denial rate statistics from Meridian's pediatric rheumatology file for the previous 18 months. Voss looked at the folder. He looked at Diane. She had called the RCMP 2 days earlier. She had also called the Nova Scotia Securities Commission. She had called them after she had assembled a complete evidentiary package and not before, because she had run a firm for 12 years and she understood the difference between a thing you know and a thing you can prove. The door at the back of the room opened at 9:22. Voss did not run. He was not the kind of man who ran. He stood up very slowly and straightened his jacket and looked at Diane with the expression of a man recalibrating rather than one who has been caught, as if this were a negotiation that had simply moved into a different room. She did not look away from him. He was still looking at her when they walked him out. The denials at Meridian Health Alliance were suspended by end of business that day. The claims flagged in the prior 24 months were queued for manual review. Diane signed the instruction herself and watched Eleanor send it before she let anyone touch the parallel bars. Gwen had moved up to the 14th floor, so she didn't have to make the trip downstairs. The first file pulled for human review, by Diane's direct instruction, was for a 12-year-old girl in Fairview with a degenerative joint condition and a rheumatologist who had been asking for 14 months for authorization to treat her. The authorization was approved before noon. Spring in Halifax comes in sideways, a little uncertain, the way good things sometimes come when you've stopped expecting them on schedule. The house Diane bought was a bungalow in the south end, one level, wide doorways, a long porch facing the garden. She had walked the length of the porch without the crutches for the first time in February. By April, she was walking to the end of the garden and back. By May, she was managing the 3 steps down to the sidewalk on her own. One hand on the rail, one hand doing nothing, which was the point. Gwen came twice a week and wrote numbers in her notebook and sometimes stayed for dinner. Marcus had taken the position at Aldergrove Capital that Diane had created in November, a newly structured adaptive equipment review role that sat across their managed care and medical supply holdings, the kind of position that did not exist before and that existed now because someone had decided it should. He drove in from Fairview 3 days a week. On the other 2, he worked from a desk in the room he had set up in their apartment, with Lily doing her homework at the table across from him. Lily had been in remission for 4 months. Her rheumatologist called it a strong response to the protocol. Marcus called it 4 months of not sitting in the parking lot with a cold car and a dark harbor. On a Saturday afternoon in June, he drove across town to the south end with Lily in the passenger seat and a container of butter tarts she had insisted on making from Eleanor's recipe, which Eleanor had given her in the formal way Eleanor gave everything, written out by hand on good paper. Diane was on the porch when they pulled up. She was standing at the railing, looking at the garden, her cane leaning against the post beside her. She used the cane less every week. Some days she forgot where she'd left it. Lily got out of the car before it had fully stopped and went up the porch steps the way 12-year-olds go up porch steps all at once with complete confidence in her knees. She put the butter tarts on the railing, and then she looked at Diane very seriously and said, "My dad said you used to not be able to do this." Diane looked at her. Do what? Stand on a porch. Lily looked at the garden and then back at her. He didn't say it like it was sad. He said it like it was the beginning of the story. Marcus had come up the steps behind her. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and said nothing because there was nothing to add to that. Diane looked out at the garden. The apple tree at the far end had come into bloom 2 weeks ago and was holding on to it. The light in the late afternoon came through the leaves at an angle that made them briefly gold before the wind moved them. "It was," she said. She picked up the butter tart Lily was holding out to her, and the 3 of them stood on the porch in the June light, and the garden held, and the tree held, and the ground beneath all of it held, the way ground does when you have finally stopped waiting for it to give out. I keep thinking about the moment Marcus stopped pushing the mop. Not because it was dramatic. It wasn't. Not from the outside. It was a man in a gray uniform pausing in a corridor at 11 o'clock at night, looking at a piece of equipment most people would never think twice about. But that pause is the whole story, really. Everything that happened after. Diane walking into that boardroom, Lily getting her medication approved, Peter Voss being walked out in handcuffs. All of it traces back to one man who chose not to look away from something that didn't sit right with him. I think about that a lot. How much of what goes wrong in the world goes wrong because the people who notice something say nothing, not because they're cruel, because they're tired or scared or they've done the math on what speaking up is likely to cost them. Marcus had done that math. He had a daughter who needed him, a heating bill, a job he couldn't afford to lose. Every reasonable instinct told him to finish his rounds and go home. He spoke anyway, and I think that's what integrity actually looks like when you strip away the inspirational language, not the grand gesture, not the speech in front of a crowd, but the quiet decision to say the true thing in a room where no one asked you to. What strikes me, too, is the way his knowledge mattered. 8 years building adaptive equipment for logging operations. Not a medical degree, not a corner office, not the kind of credential anyone in that building would have looked for, but real knowledge, earned through real work, applied at exactly the right moment. I think we underestimate that. We're taught to sort expertise by title, by institution, by the letters after a name, and sometimes that sorting works fine, but sometimes it creates a room full of people who all defer to each other and nobody actually looks at the chair. Diane had been in that room for 4 years, surrounded by managed, approved, filtered expertise, and it took someone outside that system entirely, someone nobody had cleared, nobody had vetted, nobody had assigned a role to finally tell her the truth about her own body. That's the part I sit with longest. Not the villain, not the conspiracy. The ordinary human cost of not questioning what we've been told to trust. Diane wasn't naive. She was grieving and exhausted, and she had handed her trust to a man her dying father had vouched for, and she had kept handing it over because the alternative, that she had been lied to by the person closest to her, was too heavy to carry and function at the same time. Most of us have done some version of that, kept believing a comfortable story because the true one required too much of us. The difference is most of us don't have a maintenance worker stopping in a hallway at midnight to hand us back the thing we lost. I don't think what Marcus did was supernatural. I think it was the ordinary result of a person who had held on to their sense of what's right through years of hard circumstances, who had developed real skill and kept respecting it even when the world stopped paying him for it, and who had enough left in him, enough decency, enough clarity, enough stubbornness, to say the true thing one more time in a room where it wasn't welcome. That combination, the moral backbone to speak, the competence to know what you're looking at, the resilience to keep showing up after every door has been closed in your face. That's not a formula. It's a person. And I think the reason the story lands the way it does is because most of us, somewhere, still want to be that person. We just forget sometimes that we still can be.